Thank you. So I would like to introduce the speaker for today. Just a minute, please. So my speaker is Professor Zubairu Ilyasu, who happens to be a professor of public health and community medicine at Bayero University, Kano. He's also a consultant at the Aminu Kano Teaching Hospital, and he teaches public health. He has a number of degrees from the universities of Maiduguri, Glasgow, and Sheffield, respectively. And he is the founding director for the Center for Infectious Diseases Research at Bayero University, Kano. Presently, he chairs the National Health Research Ethics Committee of Nigeria and also the National Certification Committee for Polio Eradication in Nigeria, and has over 100 peer-reviewed publications. Professor Zubairu will be represented at this webinar by Margaret M. Mafe, who is a member of the National Nigeria Health Research Ethics Committee, and she is a public health physician. I want to welcome Dr. Margaret Mafe to our webinar today, and we will set up your slides now, and please go ahead and speak. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes,
we can.
Involving Nigeria, and then to link participants to sources of guidance for further knowledge. Next slide, please. So presented before you is a list of questions just to tease your brains. Take notes, answer them on your own. As we proceed, judge or assess yourself whether you have acquired rightly or wrongly what has been presented. So these questions are, you are required to state either true or false. A, collaborative research provides access to study participants / patients. B, it could be more difficult to coordinate and implement. C, it provides access to otherwise restricted data. Then D, it facilitates learning from each other's expertise. Collaborative research, lastly, is an opportunity to acquire new skills. I'm not going to wait for answers. You just note it down somewhere, and then later on, when we finish that session, you assess yourself how you have performed, whether you have acquired new knowledge. Next slide, please. So we start with definition of research. Definition of research, we must know what research is before we go on to collaborative research. As I have no doubt, we all know, it's a systematic investigation, and it covers areas such as research, development, testing, evaluating, and designing to develop and contribute to generalizable knowledge. Next slide, please. So we said earlier, what is collaborative research? The word collaborative clearly tells us that it goes beyond the individual. It's more than one researcher. It could be in the same institution. It could be in multiple institutions. It could also be across states, within a country, or across countries, which is international. The researchers could be students, they could be professionals, it could be a mix of both. And usually it's interdisciplinary and it cuts across academic institutions. It could happen within research laboratories, etc. As mentioned earlier, there's the local multi-institutional collaboration, and there's the international one. Next slide, please. The benefits, there's so many benefits derivable from collaborative research. In many studies, particularly those that we call clinical trials, when we're investigating to know exactly the true position of things, usually we do not tend to have enough sample size. And when we collaborate either within the country or with other countries, we succeed in getting adequate participants or patients to study so that our results will be meaningful and applicable. Research collaboration also enables us to have access to expertise that we may not have, or resources in terms of maybe equipment, usually like the Biosafety Lab 4. We don't have any within this country, Nigeria, because it's so expensive. And then to maintain is another colossal sum. So it's usually in developed countries. So when there are studies where we need to investigate further and require such high-level tech, there's a need. It's mandatory that we collaborate with such laboratories to enable us get the results that are required for the benefit of mankind. Otherwise, if we do not collaborate, the other way is that we do not have adequate participants, we do not have adequate patients. So it's like a hindrance in the course of research. Collaborating also enables us to have massive data on such topic, because otherwise we would have been restricted to the data we are capable of generating. Because there are so many expertise involved in collaborative research usually, the opportunity to learn from one another is always there, and also the opportunity to learn new skills and have access to laboratories which hitherto we will not have been opportune to so do. It also enables us to publish in high-ranking journals, co-authorship, etc., which has this implication in the progression academically of the researcher. It's also a gateway, to funding, because if you publish well, your CV gets high ranking and you are likely to be patronized by research funders. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Internationally, this is a graph. Can we go back to that graph, please? This is a graph showing the trend. The previous slide, please. A trend on collaborative research, the one in red. All international collaborations, as can be clearly seen, are increasing over the years. The graph spans the period 2002 to 2020. The blue one is a collaboration with 3 or more countries over the same period. Again, the trend shows an increase. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. The typical trends in collaborative research focuses mostly on clinical trials. Clinical trials either focus at testing new approaches to treat a disease, or how to prevent the disease, or screening for early detection of the disease, or lastly, for diagnosis. Clinical trials are on the increase, particularly with these emerging pandemic diseases. None of us will forget in a hurry the COVID-19 experience. Even now, vaccines are still being developed, targeted at different levels, either for treatment, for prevention, and so on and so forth. And there are more than 100 candidates, vaccines, looking at how we can combat COVID-19. As some of you may have read recently, even up to the United States, the wife of the president had COVID not long ago. And these are people who had actually received vaccine and they've been receiving the booster doses. So we're not yet there. The other thing is that given historical perspectives, pandemics continue to occur every now and then. After that, we've had some monkeypox challenges. Diphtheria is what some parts of the world, including Nigeria, are facing as at present. Next slide, please. So these are the 4 phases of clinical trials. The first one is the one that is carried out in humans to find a safe dose to administer. The second phase, and therefore very minimum number of participants are registered or recruited. The second phase is slightly larger, and that phase looks at the efficacy, how whatever it is, whether the product is drug or vaccine or what have you, or a device, how efficiently are they performing with respect to our interests. The phase 3 compares the new agent with standard of care that's presently in place. For instance, if you look at the case of Lassa fever, there are some vaccine candidates that have been developed as at present and very soon will be tried out. Presently, there's no treatment for Lassa fever. So you have to do the best for the standard of care. And there is a drug that is being used somehow just to stem things down, or ideally it would be nice to have an ideal treatment to address the challenge. And then there's a phase 4, where several thousands of people take the product and adverse events are continually being recorded. And that is why in some cases, even now as we're speaking, some drugs, vaccines, and what have you are being removed from the market because evidence accrued thereafter, after it has been licensed or registered and made available, evidence accruing thereafter show that it causes more harm and is not doing the expected. Next slide, please. So, as hinted earlier, collaborative studies are increasingly conducted internationally, as shown in that graph. And a third of US industry-sponsored phase 3 clinical trials are conducted outside the United States in about 60% of the sites. The number of countries serving as trial sites have equally doubled between the period 1995 and 2005. There's a 10% decrease in the proportion of trials conducted in the US. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So the reason for this is because it saves costs. From some publication, it has been shown that half the cost, or 1/10 of the cost of a trial conducted in the United States is what it will take in India. So you can imagine. Above that, because of bureaucracy and complexity of the process of the regulatory system and environment in the United States, they spend half the cost to develop the new drug. The timing to look at contracts, negotiate, and so on and so forth, the whole process takes much longer than what I would call developing countries. Recruitment also is slower because the rules and regulations there are so tedious to cut across. Another issue is that it's better to try a drug where the disease is most prevalent, not just anywhere, where you can capture and have the proper sample size to observe. Next slide, please. So, as I said earlier, if the cases is more pronounced in the developing country, where the health system and healthcare is poor, you are likely to get more treatment-naive patients for your study. And the disease-specific study needs can be met, as earlier mentioned. Recruitment rates in the United States could be less than 5% because of the need for insurance, restrictions, liability concerns, etc. And when you try a product in a country that's high prevalence of the disease, you are likely to get a better market for it. Next slide, please. However, there are challenges in international collaboration. It could be political. For instance, if you want to collaborate or you have been collaborating, just as an example given here, let's say the collaborators are between Ukraine and Russia. Once you're at war, all those things are jettisoned. It can no longer happen. Then there's a socio-cultural aspect. What is acceptable in one community might not necessarily be accepted in another community. So because of the differences, that again may be a challenge in collaboration. The third one, each country is sovereign on its own, and you cannot impose the legal the laws of one country onto the other. It must be honored and recognized. And when we're doing clinical trials, usually, because of the limitation of the needed equipment, etc., and perhaps even skills in developing countries, it is mandatory that we collaborate with the laboratories or scientists in the developed countries. And this means that at some point in time, there may be a need to collect human specimen and transfer across that country for further study. In this way, there's what we call the material transfers, and there's a material transfer agreement document, as always, data sharing document, which must be signed in honor and recognition of each legal entity in the countries collaborating. And this is usually to protect the rights of the country where the specimen are taken out from or taken from, and the interest of the research participants, especially when benefits accrue, either in the course of the trial or the study or post-trial. Then there's the ethical issue. There are 7 key points that must be honored. Any clinical trial must be ethically sound and acceptable. Next slide, please. So these are the principles that I mentioned earlier. Beneficence. It must benefit the research participants and the participating country. Otherwise, there's no good in somebody taking a risk, because in any clinical trial, there's a benefit-risk ratio. The benefit-risk ratio, the benefit must override the risks. And then it's again emphasizing it must be non-maleficence. It must protect, just like in the Hippocratic Oath to medical doctors. It should not do harm as best as we can ensure. It should be more beneficial than doing harm. Autonomy is also key. We must respect the person of the research participants. He or she must be carried along at all stages, given all the information required for informed decision-making by the research participants. Then there must be justice. Whatever we're doing, you should not shortchange either the participants or particularly the developing countries' collaborator. In this wise, there must be informed consent. to the research participant, you must explain explicitly and then emphasize that the research participant has the power either to decline or to identify and therefore participate in the study, and has the right and the authority to withdraw at any stage of the study. Therefore, truth-telling is critical. Your participant must be able to trust you and vice versa. So all the truth must be put on the table. Don't shortchange the research participant because you want to recruit enough participants for your study. Confidentiality, which is a principle of autonomy, it's very important. All those who are to interact with the participant, whether you are at the desk, recording the data or in the laboratory or whatever, you must keep your mouth sealed. The instruments and where you keep the records must be passworded and limited to those who necessarily must contact such sources. The laptop must be passworded and accessible only to those who need to interact with the laptop. The cabinets that you may wish to put the hard copies must also be secured and only accessible to just the authorized people in the study. Likewise, we all human beings tend to discuss. You are not to make the mistake or error of talking about the participants outside the study with people whom you know and maybe in the same community with, or have no right whatsoever to whatever interactions you have had with the research participants. It is only in cases, very rare cases, where the participant is not capable to speak for himself and therefore has indicated prior to the study or in the course of the study that he or she will feel at home having a designated person to speak on his or her behalf. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So the ethical concerns are, it starts with the research agenda. Usually when we talk about clinical trials, the developed world has more funding than the underdeveloped or developing world. And they tend to set the research agenda. But it is important that the collaborating underdeveloped or developing countries must assert its own rights. You have no right to propose a research agenda, and I accept, that has no relevance whatsoever to my own health challenges in my country. Then the trial design. In some studies, there's room for placebo, but it's not always allowed. I'd like to make give an example of what happened sometime last year. A vaccine developing company tried to recruit countries in Africa to test a vaccine candidate against COVID-19. Nigeria opted out, and I want to believe our immediate neighboring country also did the same. Why? Because at that time, according to the NCDC data, over 40% of Nigerians had received the COVID-19 vaccine. So in the situation whereby 1 out of 2 had received, you cannot now justify the use of placebo because there's a standard of care that's internationally acceptable and also nationally acceptable and is being used. So it will not be acceptable for you to bring a vaccine in progress to try in Nigeria, a candidate vaccine, and then say you are going to compare it to just ordinary placebo that will do nothing to the patient. Although there was a promise that at the end of the study, such participants would have access to such a vaccine. And we said, there's no way. These people can die in the course of the experiment or in the course of the trial. Then, another challenge we have, particularly in developing countries, most of them do not have functional institutional review boards. In Nigeria, we call it health research ethics committees. Those are the ones that safeguard and ensure that the highest level of protection is given to the research participants so that they are not in any way exploited, particularly those who have no power of their own. We're talking about those people who are confined in prisons and such like places, people who have health challenges, children who are not capable to make decisions, women, men, in such categories, whom we categorize as the vulnerables. Also, some people like to circumvent the ethical requirements, which are so critical, by receiving unnecessary incentives. So ethically, we look out for what will be given to research participants. So you don't lure them to participate by giving them money above what is reasonable. So to ensure that you recruit the number of participants that you need. Also, in the process of approving protocol for trial, clinical trial, we look out for personal conflicting interests, particularly among those who are to screen the protocol in the Health Research Ethics Committee. Such a person has to pave way, or such a person disallowed when such protocol is being deliberated upon. And in publication, it should be clear that the participants should be acknowledged in the acknowledgement, while the participating collaborators in the other country, particularly the developing country, are acknowledged and regarded as co-authors. We have had cases where papers were published, research was said to have been done, even in Nigeria here, but no Nigerian name was on the list of the authors. Neither were the participants acknowledged or the communities in the acknowledgement. So we got a whistleblower from outside Nigeria, and this matter was investigated and due sanctions were imposed. Next slide, please. I had mentioned the conflict of interest. Giving you further insights on informed consent process, it takes cognizance of the following: the low literacy level. You know, education has something to do with appreciating what is being proposed to you. And unless you have to come to the level of the people, yeah, so that they clearly comprehend what you are trying to engage them in. So that must be taken cognizance in. The language barriers, whatever informed consent is usually in written form, must be produced in the language of the people to whom is addressed. Ensure that the people understand it, so language doesn't constitute a barrier to the autonomy of the participants. Should take cognizance of gender norms in the community where the trial will take place, the cultural do's and don'ts, and each participant is an individual. So don't just lump them together and get group approval. You can get group approval indirectly, not in that sense, but we have gatekeepers if you're going to the communities. If it's not clinic-based, if it's community-based, you must go through the gatekeepers and involve them in the implementation of such research. They're better able to guide you as to what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, and the best time for you to come for your samples, and so on and so forth. I had mentioned the post-trial benefits that could be accruable, whether it's availability of intervention, post-trial, during trial, etc. Any patient, any participant during the research has the right to withdraw, and every effort must be made by the researcher to maintain the health of the participant to the highest level possible. So there must be constant monitoring post-intervention. And if anything is detected that indicates, or even the data that proceeding further would result in harming the participants, such must be reported to the Ethics Committee and also NAFDAC, the Food and Drugs Agency, who would then take a decision to halt the study. Both regulatory bodies are also allowed to listen to whistleblowers, and the basis of that, following investigation, have rights to terminate such trial without giving notice to the researchers. Next slide, please. So we cannot but continue to emphasize the three principles: respect for the research participants, minimum harm, and maximum benefits. The respect requires that the subject give their informed consent. It must be in writing. Even if they cannot write, they can put a thumbprint, and then somebody within the community or their family would countersign to say that, yes, such a person consented and is adequately aware of the benefits and possible risks of engaging in such trial. For beneficiaries, you must ensure that your research design is acceptable. So that's what IRB looks at when they submit the protocol. Is that the possible research design to maximize benefits and minimize harm? Does it require, it requires that researchers are able to perform the procedures and manage the risk, i.e. they're adequately trained and experienced, not just put anybody who is not familiar with the method they want to use in the study, or able to quickly observe any anomaly or abnormality that needs to be addressed. And any research without a favorable risk ratio is not unacceptable. Justice, you must treat everybody equally. You must respect everybody equally and ensure that the burden and benefits are shared equitably. There should be equitable selection of research participants. Don't go and take the vulnerable because you know that they have no voice. It will not be allowed. And these are things that are looked out for during ethical appraisal of research protocol before approval is granted. And you do not exploit, as I said, the vulnerable population, incarcerated populations, pregnant women, children, people in confinement, incarcerated like prisoners, etc., or remand homes. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So there have been so many codes that have emerged based on past ugly incidents. There's a Declaration of Helsinki developed by the World Health Medical Association, now referred to as World Health Organization. It's broader than the Nuremberg Code, and is targeting or is geared towards therapeutic medical research. It recommends informed consent, which is a precursor to IRB requirements. In journals these days, it is the practice that if you want to publish a paper on any research conducted on humans, you have to provide your ethical approvals, your ethical approval for that study. So we again emphasize the three principles: the respect for persons. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. We have the good clinical practices, sometimes called the good research practices. It's a standard for the design, conduct, performance, monitoring, analysis, and reporting of research. It's a global standard. Every research, clinical research, must follow the good clinical practices. And there is a cost. For you to have your protocol approved, you must exhibit that you have already undertaken and possess the certificates in good clinical practice. There's also good laboratory practice. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So the scandals led to the development of the various codes to protect the human participants. The Nazi experiments, prisoners were taken for granted by the Nazi doctors, and they did all sorts of horrible, heinous, unspeakable experiments of people in confinement. Of course, it ended up in a lot of them dying because there were no rules. There was no informed consent that was applied at the time. Then there's this Tuskegee syphilis studies. Yeah, some Black people were infected with syphilis, and the doctors refused to give them the needed treatment, even though it was available, because they wanted to follow the cause of the infection to the end, even though it may end and did end in the deaths of some of the participants. Then there's the Nuremberg Code emerged from some of these scandals. Nuremberg Code emphasized the voluntariness of the involvement of participants, competence of the researcher. The participant must be informed and clearly made to understand the implication of consenting to be a research subject. The Helsinki Declaration, as I said, is that the Hippocratic oath of the medical doctors. Every effort must be made to safeguard the health of the research participants. The Belmont Report emphasizes respect for autonomy, beneficence, justice. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. The Nuremberg Code, as mentioned earlier, the Nazi doctors and scientists, no guideline for human research, which emerged in the need for informed consent. And research should be based on prior animal work, which is being done now. Before you proceed to phase 1 clinical trial, science must have been proven in the animal model in the laboratory to show that we can adequately now proceed with using the candidates, whether it be drug or vaccine, to humans. And the risks should be justified by the anticipated benefits. And as I mentioned earlier, only qualified scientists must conduct research. The researchers must prevent every way possible any physical or mental suffering by the research participant, which may accrue from people going around. If you do a study on a sexually transmitted infection, I know the status of a patient, and then you have told or you are telling people around such a person, you can imagine the trauma, the kind of mental suffering such a person will go through, especially when other people do not know the status of the health of such a person. And no research should be conducted where death or severe injury is expected. Next slide, please. The Tuskegee syphilis I had mentioned earlier, it was originally designed to make treatments available to African American men with syphilis, even though there was no known effective treatment. The men were recruited without their consent, misinformation about the procedure. They were using as far as spinal taps. And after penicillin was proven as effective treatment, they were denied. You can see how vicious or unkind human beings are. Next slide, please. Next slide. The Kano one, I'm sure many of you cannot or could not have forgotten in a hurry. During meningitis epidemic in 1996, Pfizer administered Trovan on some children. 5 of the children died, although 6 also died that were given ceftriaxone. And at least 1 child was not taking off the experimental drug and giving standard drug when it was clear that our condition was not improving is against ethical guidelines. What is even horrific about this trial was that Pfizer did not subject their protocol to ethical clearance in Nigeria before proceeding with this. And of course, although sadly, some children were lost, but I think they paid a huge sum because it was made a court case. Next slide, please. So again, our Nigerians should be sensitive or show love to our fellow Nigerian or any country indeed, because some people, God knows why, I don't know why those who were involved in such trial in Kano who were Nigerians did not, stress the need for the protocol to be approved by an ethical body, Health Research Ethics Committee at the time, or by the Ministry of Health or something, before proceeding on what they did. The same drug was withdrawn in Europe because they found it had liver toxicity and caused some deaths. Next slide, please. We have mentioned the ethical codes, the Nuremberg Code, the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, the World Medical Association, etc. And the emphasis in all these is the risk-benefit ratio, protection of confidentiality, the in-trial and post-trial benefits, and the risk of exploitation. Next slide, please. We cannot but continue to emphasize, again, we have here respect for persons, beneficence, justice. Next slide, please. So the research plan must be reviewed by an independent ethics review committee, which is what I said in Nigeria is called Health Research Ethics Committee. Before any trial is conducted, it must be reviewed for its science and compliance with ethical standards. In such review, every analysis, the protocol will be reviewed for the risk and benefit ratio and refer to previous studies that may have been carried out to whatever be the candidates they're using for intervention, what their outcome had been in the past, and justification for using the research design that is proposed. And consequently, a reasonable risk-benefit ratio must be attained. For instance, when we say minimize the risk and a reasonable risk-benefit, the risk will be vis-a-vis when you go out daily as an individual, you cross the road. You do not anticipate that you'll be knocked down either by a tricycle, a bus, or whatever. But sometimes some of these happen. So these are natural risks. So the kind of risk that the study must carry must be of that level and no more. There must be adequate plan by taking insurance for those research participants in the event that something that was not anticipated surfaces. So adequate plan for the care and compensation of participants for injuries directly related to the research must be presented. Individual informed consent is a sine qua non, must be obtained from each and every participant. And they must all receive equal consideration and care. There must be equitable distribution of burden and benefits of the research. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. As I said at the earlier on while I started this, the research performed in less developed countries by scientists from developing countries should be relevant to the local situation. Otherwise, it will be deemed as exploitation. It must address a problem of importance to the local population and have the potential to benefit that population. The research aimed at developing and testing therapies that will never be available or affordable for population in less developing countries is totally unacceptable. Parallel activities unrelated to research plan should provide direct and immediate benefits, to the research participants and the community at large. E.g., if there's a free immunization, screening for other endemic diseases, etc., they should be accommodated and ensure that they should benefit. Next slide, please. So at the conclusion of a study, every patient entering in the study must be assured of access to the best proven prophylactic, diagnostic, and therapeutic methods identified by the study. This is emphasized in the Declaration of Helsinki, Principle 30. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So this quiz now follows. You have the first quiz. This is for you to answer because we're now going into this other section. Indicates whether the following statements are true or false. Don't tell me, you just note it down somewhere. Regarding approvals for international collaborative research. A, double review of protocols by ethics committee in the two countries is the norm. B, material transfer agreements are essential for every international collaborative research. C, in addition to ethical clearance, approval should be obtained from the Food Drug Administration for new drugs, new medical devices, and repurposed formulations. D, data transfer agreements are required if data is to be shared. Intellectual property rights is discussed after a discovery is made. So jot for yourself in your notes somewhere whether any of the, or A, B, C, D, E, either any one of them is true or false. Next slide, please. So we're navigating ethical approvals. In externally sponsored research in developing countries, both the donor and recipient countries share full responsibility for conducting the research. That is, that the research is both ethical and meets the health priorities of the recipient country. We should ensure that the research meets both the ethical standards of the research sponsor and the developing country. If you want further information, you can, because the slide I hope will be shared, you can read the references provided on this. The developing country Health Research Ethics Committee could lack the resources to independently assess some of the risks associated with the research under review. For instance, genomic studies, AI related. In this wise, you have the ethics committee in Nigeria is allowed to access experts, trusted experts, to help, to guide in providing such information. And then the literature is there. People should read the literature, connect with experts in this field for further advice before they proceed in taking decisions. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So hence, there's a need for double ethical review. One in the country that is proposing the study, because if it's ethically sound in his own country, then we can consider it here. We also appraise the protocol and ensure that it is ethically sound before approval is granted. It ensures that all perspectives that are relevant are taken into account, both by the overseas country and the country where the trial or the study will be conducted. These are further references that can be referred to. Next slide, please. Next slide. In Nigeria, our research regulatory system is the National Research National Health Research Ethics Committee is the apex for research in Nigeria. And its existence is backed by the 2014 National Health Act, which is its legal framework. It's empowered to set the norms and standards. It reviews protocols at the national level. It registers and audits subnational health research ethics committees, and it advocates in complaints about health research ethics committees. Subnational health research ethics committees, the RECs, are established by institutions, ministries, departments, and agencies that conduct health-related research. They are, however, registered under categories based on the experience of the institution vis-a-vis the composition of the Health Research Ethics Committee, their capacity and resources. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. We have the code, the national code, which defines research as a systematic investigation, including development, testing, and evaluation that contributes to generalizable knowledge. As we all know, or perhaps know, there are two categories. There's a therapeutic procedure is administered with the intent of providing direct benefits to the research participants. And there is the non-therapeutic procedure, which are not administered with therapeutic intent and are not intended to answer a scientific question. However, they give us generalizable knowledge. All research that must be conducted within this nation, Nigeria, must conform with the code, with the National Code of Health Research Ethics, which can be accessed if you can access the website, www.nrec.net. You see it there. Next slide, please. It gives all the details on how the National Health Research Ethics Committee operates. So this is the front page. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. In the conduct of local multi-institutional research, each institution is responsible for safeguarding the rights and welfare of human participants in its institution and for complying with the code. Where there are no more than 3 Nigerian research sites, the principal investigator at each site may apply to his institutional rec for review. What is this? What are we saying here? Each institutional health research ethics committee can review protocols, different phases of the clinical trials, provided it is so categorized in its registration with the National Health Research Ethics Committee. B, next slide, please. B, next slide, please. But when there are more than 3 sites to be involved in conducting the research, approval must be sought from the National Health Research Ethics Committee in Abuja. Applicants may apply as a research group to the National Health Research Ethics Committee directly, and that should suffice. However, each one of the 3 sites or more sites want to apply individually, it's okay, but ideally, there should be a PI coordinating all the various sites that should be the one processing for approval of the protocol. If the research includes a new drug, as I mentioned earlier, or new device or a repurposed formulation, double approvals are mandated or mandatory. NAFDAC must approve while ethics also approves. So it is recommended that submissions are made at the same time to lessen the time for response from the 2 bodies. And if it's a clinical trial, it must be registered. yeah, with the Pan-African Clinical Trials Registry or clinicaltrials.gov. Next slide, please. Next slide. It is mandatory that international collaborative research must have a local PI who will stand and speak to the project, whether pro or con, not the outside collaborator. Is the inside internal Nigerian co-PI that holds responsibility for the conduct of the research on Nigerian soil. The protocol should be reviewed and approved by an institutional REC or IRB or NREC, the National Research Ethics Committee. So the protocol should be submitted to REC or NREC. If samples are to be exported, you need a material transfer agreement. All these prototypes are inside the National Code on Health Research Ethics. Next slide, please. Let's move faster now because of time. Are we there? Yeah, so the material transfer has to do with transferring any biological materials from humans, animals, and plants outside Nigeria, requires MTA. The details, you must detail all the various things that are entailed in the code. Yeah, and the purpose of the MTA is to protect the interests of local researchers and prevent exploitation of Nigerians' human and Nigerian resources in all its biodiversity. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Data sharing, because there are going to be data accruing from different sites, there must be an agreement that data will be allowed to be transferred and shared, and so an agreement must be signed. If a clinical trial, the clinical trial, okay. We now go quickly to the steps you have to follow to submit your application for ethical review. These are all listed. If you go to the website, all the things that you have to conform with to submit your protocol. If it's inadequate, the desk officer will notify you that you have to go and address the gaps. And online submission is the key. You are not mandated to bring hard copy. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, so it has to have electronic copy, as I said. They have the cover page, the title of research, full name. All these details are inside that code. I would urge you to please visit the www.nrec.net. You'll get the code there. It's all entailed therein. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So these are all the process. It must contain a background, rationale, objectives, and so on. Data collection procedure, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And we have a sub-policy on enrollment of children for any trial. Children are categorized as vulnerable, but if there are cases where they need to be recruited, there are guidelines. So in any protocol, there must be a section addressing ethical, which is called the ethical considerations section. How do you plan to combat or ensure ethically acceptable research protocol in the course of your trial? Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So these are continuum of the items that you have to accompany your submission. Next slide. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier, when you are submitting a protocol for approval, you must have the certificate of having experience or having gone through either the CITI or TRREE training online, in those key areas that are considered relevant to clinical trials. So in concluding, international collaborators or donors, they have the responsibility of complying with the ethical rules of their own country and the recipient country. Most developing countries, unfortunately, have ethics review boards that maintain independent reviews, no, fortunately. But some of them, a number of them don't have. In many cases, the review mechanism needs to be strengthened. And if appropriate, the collaboration should strengthen the system in the long run. The responsibility of the Health Research Ethics Committees is a large one to ensure that protocols meet ethical standards from scientific, biomedical, and development standpoints. The Health Research Ethics Committee are also mandated to have oversight on all the approved protocols, i.e. go to the field and see that the researchers are conforming to what they committed themselves to in the submitted and approved protocol. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Guidance is provided for collaborative research, both locally and internationally. Researchers are encouraged to abide by the National Code of Research Ethics. For international collaborative research, the team should include a local co-investigator and the protocol reviewed and approved by relevant ethics and regulatory agencies in both countries. Submission for review should be to ethics committees in both countries. I want to believe that's the last slide. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mafe. Thank you for this wonderful lecture. We have a couple of questions for you, so we'll take them very quickly.
Yes.
The first question says, one of the challenges of collaborative research is balancing individual priorities and to remain focused on shared goals. So can you speak to that, knowing that collaborating researchers have different motivations? Are there any ethical principles that addresses this challenge?
I had mentioned, or I touched on one or two of them earlier. When a research protocol is submitted, the researcher must show that he or she is not in any way, does not have any conflict of interest, i.e. being sponsored or being favored in one way or the other by the applicant. Number two, when such a person finds himself or herself in the Health Research Ethics Committee that is considering such protocol, such a one should excuse or should be excused from deliberation on that protocol. Then number three, incentives that are being provided by the funders should not be such that will override the autonomy of the research participants. I hope those are some of them.
Okay, thank you. This question from Isaac says, how do we deal with conflict of interest among ethics committee members, considering that the researchers may buy them over prior to review?
There's no way. You see, you have people of high integrity in health research ethics committees. And it's not just, it's composed of lawyers, administrators, community representatives, nurse, medical doctors, scientists, and so on. So different interests. You cannot, cajole or, get them under your armpits. And the first thing in the process of reviewing a protocol, the chairman announces, we have this protocol for review. Each one of you, please state whether you have conflict of interest. Because there are implications, there are sanctions. If it is found that you have conflict of interest and you didn't declare. And then there are usually whistleblowers. Even the protocol may indicate without the participant, the researcher, knowing, in writing the list of collaborators or researchers that will participate in such research, you can detect it from there, or from people who are within the same institution, if it's that institution, that such a person who is on the review board is part and parcel of this study. So there are mechanisms to detect. If in event it is reported that such a one was allowed to participate, there are sanctions. Yeah, so usually we screen out such issues or such challenges.
Okay, thank you. Nelson is saying that there is a certain state in Northeast Nigeria that recently constituted an ethics committee that will be in charge of monitoring the human and animal research within the state. And then you have a researcher in that state who has obtained ethical clearance from your committee. That isn't it a conflict of interest or a conflicting role for a researcher to have to obtain the ethical clearance from you when they have an ethics committee domiciled in their state?
I think I mentioned on this earlier. Number one, the person who is asking the question should tell us, did they have more than 3 sites for that study? If it is more than 3 sites, the local or institutional rec has no power to consider or approve such protocol. Number 2, what category of registration are they holding? Does the registration of that rec, does it qualify to vet such a protocol? These are things we need to know. So if they're not qualified, they go straight to national.
Okay, another question is, there are several ethical questions that have been raised by the production of the COVID-19 vaccine. And some of them include vaccine access and equity, use of vaccine passports, and then clinical trial conduct. What is your opinion on rapid vaccine production and the use of clinical trials for that?
Well, there's nothing like that. I can't understand what you mean by rapid vaccine production. There's nothing like rapid vaccine production because there are stages you must go through for clinical trials before you can conduct the clinical trial. The science must be proven. And this is looked into by the Food and Drugs Administration in Nigeria, NAFDAC, elsewhere is now FDA. If they don't accept and approve, they cannot go to the first phase. Yeah, so that is number one. Number two, you cannot talk of anything. I mean, there are stages that you have to go through, and there are regulatory agencies that have to give the needed approvals for it to go forward. Sorry, what was the other thing that the person said? Can you repeat the question again, please, quickly?
Okay, I was saying, what is your view on rapid vaccine production and its use of clinical trials for rapid vaccine production?
Well, for you to produce vaccine, it first of all starts in the laboratory. You don't just jump to human beings. So when the science has been proven, as checked, there's so many parameters that have to be checked on this science thing by the Food and Drugs Administration. Once they have certified it that it shall now go to the next stage of clinical trial, then it goes there. So there's nothing like rapidity. But what we're saying, I think they mentioned something about the vaccine not being accessible to developing countries. That's unethical. That is highly unethical. And that's what happened during the COVID-19 experience. They participated in some of the development, but when the vaccines were produced, the cost of it was beyond our wherewithal. But then we are guarding against that, even as at now. It should not be. It's unethical.
Okay, and the last question says, how do we bridge the gap between the participant who has the right to medical care post-trial? Because here in Nigeria, many participants are not aware of this right. Can an independent party take that up?
Well, as I said during the lecture, number one, there's this informed consent document. It's so important. In fact, it's critical. It should embody that in the event that so and so and so this trial ends, and we found the product beneficial, you'll be able to have access to the product. And I mentioned it in 2 or 3 slides. So there's no way, and if such a thing is happening, somebody should go and complain. That's why in the informed consent, all the addresses, contact details of the researchers, and even the IRB that approved, etc., should be on that consent form. So you can easily access and say, this is what I observed, I'm being shortchanged, or consequences so and so, these are the complaints that I have, and it should be duly addressed. Participants also have a right to ask any question under the sky when they're being recruited, particularly things that have to do with their well-being during the trial and post-trial.
Post-trial. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Margaret. I will call on the Director for the Center for Translation and Implementation Research, Professor Echezona Ezanole, to say a few words.
Thank you.
you so much, Dr. Mafe. It was so nice listening to you and go over this. This is a very important thing for our country. You know, in listening to you, there's something that you said it many times, but I want to repeat it because I think for me, that is the core of this. The Nigerian, on every study done in Nigeria, has a responsibility. This is your people, they're not guinea pigs. And you have a responsibility when you are part of that study. So it's not only the person who is coming in from wherever they come from. The Nigerian on that study who allowed that study to happen in that place, whose name is also on that. I believe that most studies that are happening in Nigeria would have a Nigerian counterpart. There are usually very few people that will fly over from anywhere and be able to conduct study in Nigeria. That's not true. There is always a counterpart in Nigeria, and that counterpart in Nigeria has a responsibility. Yes, we talk about Pfizer. Yes, we talk about what happened with Pfizer. There was a Nigerian company that made that possible, and that person and people and agency and organization has a responsibility. So I think you said it many times, and I wanted to point that out, that was something that stuck with me, to say all of us that are on study, not only do we have a responsibility to get our study done, we have a responsibility to the people that trust us. Remember, they don't know this person that is coming in. It's us that they know and trust. And sometimes they will accept the study because they trust that we're not going to hurt them. So it's a betrayal of trust if we let those kind of study that we see and we're educated. When you're a professor, you come in and tell somebody participate in this study and they say, this is from my place. This person is from my place. And he said, this is good. You know that that is true in our place, that they are going to say this is good because they think you're looking out for them. I think we should know that that's a responsibility we have. So that's the second thing I want to say is that we are very grateful because of Nigeria is one of the few countries in Africa that have a national IRB. And a national IRB becomes very important because research is actually important. Research is not a burden to our people, because if our people do not participate, then they finish producing those drugs, or then they give it to our people, even though we don't know how we will react to it because we were never participating. So it is important for us to encourage our people to actually participate. So we should remove barriers to doing them. And I have to really shout out to the NREC. We have studies, and so many other people, not just other, have studies that are in multiple states, in multiple regions across the country. That's where NREC comes in. You have a study that is happening in 6 regions of Nigeria. You have a study that is happening in more than 3 states. You have a study that's happening. You don't need NREC for a study that's happening in one site in one hospital. They should find a local IRB so that we don't overwhelm NREC. But when you have a study that is happening multi-site, multi-center, and sometimes multi-region and multi-state, that's a perfect study for NREC. They provide us not everything. We that are on the study have a responsibility. They provide another secondary responsibility to look at, to make sure, because if you're part of the study, you're biased. And being biased is not a bad thing, but you recognize that bias. So you look at the study from your own perspective, but you want another person. And that's when NREC is very critical, to make sure that any study that you're doing, that NREC approves it. I think it's important, is for your protection as an investigator. It is not against you, it's your protection is NREC. So I really want to thank you and thank the Director General for NREC for all the work you do. We really, really appreciate, I know I've served in IRB for 5 years in the US, and I understand how much work it is to review those protocols, and you do them. I know that it's a service to the country. I know that what you're doing have actually improved research in Nigeria. It has actually encouraged more research in Nigeria, which I think was the goal you set out to do. And thank you so much for taking this opportunity to speak with us. And we hope you will come back next time, because we think IRB is that important for us that we think every year there should be a refresher, just like we do our cities every 2 years. But this knowledge is, again, if you didn't hear it today, next time again, we hope that we have another audience where you will come again, because we think this is important. Thank you so much, Dr. Mafe.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mafe. Thank you, everyone,
for
staying up to this time and listening. Just to let you know that if you look at the chat, you find out that this recording was live. So this recording and past webinars are on our YouTube channel. And thank you for staying on, and bye-bye, and see you next month. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.